Mani Napudni, welcome everyone, welcome back. Welcome back to day 2 of the 2024 Australian Homelessness Conference. We're at the halfway mark. Yesterday's sessions I think were a fantastic start to the conference, and we have another packed day in store today. Before we start, I'd like to once again acknowledge the Kaurna people, the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting here in Tandanya, Adelaide, and pay my respects to elders past and present. It was great to connect with so many of you yesterday, some great discussions, both in the formal conference sessions and in the networking breaks. I hope you had a chance to take in the exhibits in the exhibition hall, including the fascinating Public Housing Design Innovation exhibition. Personally, I found the plenary sessions yesterday really thought-provoking, seeing the scale of investment in the US and really an honest reflection of the challenges for our First Nations people. Like all of you, I couldn't get to all of the concurrent sessions, but we are recording all of those sessions and we will make them all available to you through the conference portal very soon. We have another fascinating international plenary session coming up in a moment, looking at the sector perspective at systemic changes needed to end homelessness. I've also been asked to mention that during the lunch break, a group of like-minded individuals interested in rooming houses wants to pick up on some of the conversations yesterday. They'll be meeting over by the registration area, so feel free to join them to talk more about innovations in that space during the break. I do also have one small item of housekeeping, noting a typo in the Pocket program for those of you using the printed programs. The afternoon concurrent sessions all begin at 1:45, not 2 p.m. as the ones on page 19 seem to indicate. And all of the details in the conference portal are correct. So 1:45 for everyone for the post-lunch sessions. With that housekeeping out of the way, I'll now hand over to my colleague, Tom Alves, for our opening sessions of day 2. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the conference. My name is Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this plenary session. Before we get underway with the session, I'd like to thank St Patrick's Community Services, or St Pat's, for their sponsorship of this session, and we're now going to see a short video from them.
How do we end chronic homelessness? It starts with leadership, being bold in our action and brave despite the challenges we face.
By working together and pooling our resources and expertise, we get the best outcomes for the people we support.
By applying evidence-based models and collating our data to better measure our impact.
By providing safe and suitable homes for people with the support they need to sustain their housing.
By providing appropriate healthcare in a way that meets people's immediate and long-term needs.
By treating people with dignity, respect and fairness, meeting people where they are and walking with them on their journey.
By giving people a choice in the support they need, setting them up for housing success.
Through justice and truth-telling and being honest about the continuing barriers to equality.
By making people feel welcome, secure and valued in our community.
We all have a part to play in ending chronic homelessness. What's yours?
Thank you very much, St Pat's, for your support of the conference and for this particular session. I'd also like to thank our other sponsors, particularly our host partner, the Government of South Australia, one of our principal sponsors, along with Business Events Adelaide and the Adelaide Convention Centre. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge the people who have come to our conference with lived experience of homelessness and of housing vulnerability, and for the incredible contribution that your experiences and your expertise are making to this conference. And I'd like to thank Mission Australia, who have assisted that by sponsoring our supported delegates. Our keynote presentation this morning is from Tim Richter. Tim is the CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Following Tim's presentation, which we're really looking forward to just now, we'll be joined, he and I will be joined on the stage by two other people, Carmel, Haugh, who is the Brisbane Zero leader, and also David Pearson, who is the CEO of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness. So we're looking forward to a great conversation following Tim's presentation, and after that we'll be opening up for questions to the floor. So do formulate your questions while you're listening to Tim's presentation, because we'll have an opportunity to discuss those later on. So Tim, please come up here and join me. I haven't given a detailed bio of Tim, but if you have your name tag on, you'll see there's a QR code on the back, and if you use that, you can access the conference portal on your phone, and there are detailed bios of all of the speakers from all of the sessions that you can read there. Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, AHURI, for having me. Good morning, well, afternoon, depends on the time zone I kind of feel like I'm in. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is my first time ever in Australia, and I kind of feel like I'm visiting favorite cousins and uncles and aunts who live in a really cool place, but have funny names for things. I'm really struck, though, by how much Canada and Australia have in common for good and for ill, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to learn from you, and I've really enjoyed the sessions that I've been able to take in so far. So today I'm going to take a few minutes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a Canadian perspective on ending homelessness. So to start, I want to start, as you do, with a land acknowledgement, or acknowledgement of the territory. So I'm from a small town just west of Calgary, Alberta, which is on Treaty 7 territory. It's traditional lands of the Stoney Nakoda peoples, of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley bands. There's also the Tsuut'ina, the Blackfoot people, of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai bands. And the area is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. I also want to acknowledge, as you have, that we're meeting this morning on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and pay respect to elders past and present. And I recognize and respect the cultural heritage and beliefs in relationship with the land. In Canada, I think like Australia, Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of our overall population, but more than 30% of people experiencing homelessness. And in some communities, like Winnipeg in Manitoba, Indigenous people are over 70% of those experiencing homelessness. And so we have to understand, certainly in Canada, we're recognizing that colonization and cultural genocide have to be understood as critical factors leading to homelessness for Indigenous people. But we're also recognizing that that housing and homeless systems are actually still part of the machinery of colonization. Our work to end homelessness is an act of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, but we have to have, as part of our work to end homelessness, an intentional, thoughtful, and deliberate effort at decolonization. So, I don't know about you, but I kind of feel like the little dude in the red shorts when working to end homelessness. I'm sure many of you feel the same. I wish I could come here and tell you that in Canada we've got this all figured out. Sadly, the situation in Canada is verging on catastrophic when it comes to homelessness. We are dealing with multiple compounding crises. We have a housing crisis that is 40 years or more in the making. We shared the impact of the global pandemic. We have subsequent cost of living crisis. We're dealing with an awful drug poisoning crisis, which means we're seeing a wave of new homelessness, the likes of which I don't think we've seen in Canada in generations, if ever before. And it's a wave of homelessness that is much more visible than Canadians are used to, and much more lethal than ever. As a result, we're seeing waning public support for the work we're doing, and growing unease and discomfort with visible homelessness getting worse and worse. Populist political forces are exploiting this fear, this public unease, and that's driving pressure on cities to use criminalization to respond to unsheltered homelessness in particular. We see a growing kind of withdrawal back into emergency responses to homelessness and the use of enforcement. Communities are overwhelmed, right? And burnout, fatigue, moral injury, they're really beginning to see that plague the sector. Our frontline workers are being asked to do more with limited resources, and homelessness is overwhelming. But in spite of this, I still firmly believe that homelessness is solvable and that ending homelessness is possible. And I believe that homelessness can be rare, brief, and non-recurring, and that there's a path forward. And that's what I'm going to talk a bit about today. So this is a photo from the downtown east side of Vancouver. Some of you would have heard about it. The loss of housing Canada is experiencing today is higher than that of our largest natural disasters. We estimate between 265 and 300,000 different people will experience homelessness this year. In fact, overnight, I caught an article from Ontario where unofficial provincial government estimates say that as many as 230,000 people in Ontario alone will experience homelessness. So this is bigger than our largest natural disaster. So I'm from Calgary. In 2013, we had a flood that forced 77,000 households out of their homes. In 2016, in Fort McMurray, northern Alberta, a city of 85,000 was forced to evacuate due to wildfire. And last summer, Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, was forced to evacuate due to wildfire as well, and that's a town or a city of 15,000. Homelessness is also in Canada among our top 10 most lethal disasters in Canadian history. There was just a report out last week that said homelessness in Canada will erase 17 years off of a person's life. It is a humanitarian disaster in any way of measuring it. But the good news about homelessness is that it's solvable, it's preventable, right? You can't necessarily stop a storm or a fire, but you can stop homelessness. So I think it's important to know if we're gonna try and solve it, we need to understand why it's happening. Homelessness is not caused by mental illness or addiction or any personal fault or failing. Homelessness is a housing problem. Homelessness is a housing problem. And I want to illustrate this with using musical chairs, which I'm told Australian kids also do. So imagine a game of musical chairs. You got 10 kids, you got 10 chairs, right? The music will play, music stops, the kids will sit down. Now, in this game, of these 10 kids, there's a girl named Alice. Alice has got a broken ankle, right? And so the music, they take a chair away, the music starts, the music stops, everybody sits down but Alice. Now, if you asked Alice, you said, well, how come you're still standing? She'd say, well, it's because I've got a broken ankle and I can't get to the chair as fast as the other kids. Now, is she without a chair because she has a broken ankle? Or is she without a chair because there aren't enough chairs? Chairlessness is the inevitable outcome of a game without enough chairs. Homelessness is the inevitable outcome of a system without enough housing. Right? So, I think it's also important to note that that doesn't mean that we have to wait until we've got a perfect system, we've got enough housing to begin to act to end homelessness. And it's not to say that precipitating factors like the broken ankle, things like racism, colonization, addiction, mental illness, that they aren't factors. But that doesn't explain rates of homelessness. So there's a really good book out of the United States by a guy named Greg Colburn and his partner Clayton Aldern called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. The conclusion's in the title. They tried to understand why do some U.S. cities have higher rates of homelessness than other U.S. cities. So they looked at factors like poverty, They looked at rates of mental illness and addiction. They looked at weather. They looked at whether they were Democrat or Republican, because surely the Democrats or Republicans must be at fault for one thing or another. But what they found was when you looked at all of the factors, the only evidence that explained the difference in the rate of homelessness was the cost of rent and vacancy. In high rent, low vacancy environments, you had higher homelessness. It wasn't poverty. Detroit has among the highest rates of poverty in the United States and lower rates of homelessness. West Virginia has among the highest rates of addiction, but the lowest rate, one of the lower rates of homelessness. It isn't even weather. You can't, when you compare, Los Angeles and Boston on a per capita basis, that doesn't explain differences in the rate of homelessness. Only the housing market. High rent, low vacancy equals higher homelessness. Understanding homelessness as a housing problem is really, 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 really important, right? Because if we continue to individualize homelessness, we're inevitably, attribute it to addiction or a mental illness or some personal fault or failing. We're going to continue to chase the wrong solutions. We have to solve a structural problem with structural solutions. Again, which is not to say we're not powerless to do anything about it. I think there's more than enough resources for us to get started solving homelessness. And what we don't have, we can make happen. And in my mind, one of the biggest mistakes, and a lot of folks here are in the housing and homelessness policy world, and I don't know about Australia, but in Canada, often it's one department that's doing homelessness, another department that's doing housing, right? Well, you can't solve homelessness without housing. We built an entire national housing strategy in Canada. The vast majority of the billions of dollars invested won't house anybody experiencing homelessness because the housing policy was done by one group and the homelessness policy by another. And the two weren't connected. So where does modern mass homelessness in Canada come from? So it's not always been this way. Like, I'm old enough to remember a day when there wasn't homelessness on the scale we see it. And it really began as a result of successive government disinvestment in housing. A story, I'm told, is also familiar here in Australia. It began in the 1980s. So in most of Canada's rental housing stock was actually built before 1980. And that's because before 1980, the federal government provided incentives for the construction of rental housing. Those began to come off in 1980, and cuts to affordable housing programs began through austerity. Canada was a pretty enthusiastic acolyte of Reaganomics and Thatcherism and all of that austerity business, and the results are seen on our streets. In 1996, so the gentleman on the right is Brian Mulroney, who was our Conservative Prime Minister until about 1993. And on the left is Prime Minister Chrétien and his Finance Minister Paul Martin, who later became Prime Minister. In 1996, the Chrétien-Martin government eliminated the federal affordable housing program and cut social transfers to province that funded welfare and healthcare and things like that. And so the provinces did the same. We went from building about 25,000 units of affordable housing a year in 1983 to zero after 1996. And you fast forward to the pandemic, right? And now we're seeing, and like I'm sure you've seen here, people pushed out of their homes, and then people already experiencing homelessness pushed out of shelter for health reasons, social distancing, all those things, or fear. People experiencing homelessness were 5 times more likely to die from COVID, 11 times more likely to end up in ICU, 20 times more likely to catch it in the first place. And that began to spark a rise of encampments in the country. And hot on the heels of the pandemic, we saw a cost of living crisis that had a dramatic impact on lowest income households. So in Canada, the inflation rate is measured by the Consumer Price Index, which is a basket of goods in a middle income home. But if you're a low income home, 90% of your budget is rent and food. Through the cost of living crisis, rent was going up 20, 30%. Food was going up 10, 15% every year. If you're a low-income household, you have no wiggle room to absorb that kind of change. And so people were forced out of their housing and onto the streets. And then they were met there by a drug poisoning crisis. So with that, I want to talk a bit about what it's going to take to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. And I think there's two really critical first steps. There's obviously more to it than this, but there's two really critical things. First, we got to deal with affordable rental housing. And the second, we need to build local systems modeled on disaster response. Remember, I talked about homelessness being a disaster. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a second. A year ago, to deal with the housing crisis in Canada, a year ago, we got together with a group called RealPAC, which is the real estate industry group, and another group called the Place Center, and built the National Housing Accord. Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation estimates that by 2030, in order to restore affordability to our housing market, Canada needs to build 3.5 million units of housing, 2 million purpose-built rental. Canada also has one of the lowest rates of social housing, so social housing as a percentage of the overall rental housing market, or overall housing market, at about 3.5%. For us to get to the OECD average, we have to build 655,000 units of social and supportive housing. To put that in perspective, in the last 30 years, Canada's built 500,000 units of purpose-built rental housing. For interest sake, I looked up Australia. And in Australia, apparently, Canada's at 3.5%, Australia's 3.2%. And interestingly, when you look at the rent burden, so of the households that are spending more than 40% of their income on rent, 35% of renter households in Canada are spending more than 40% of their income on rent. In Australia, 25% are doing so. So solving this is a massive undertaking. It's $1 trillion problem, and it's not going to be solved by any one sector alone. And so we built the National Housing Accord, which is a 10-point plan, and I joked to the government that I could have called it Back to the Future, because damn near everything in there has been done before. We actually went back to the 1980s and said, you know, when we solved the housing crisis in the 60s, we had accelerated capital cost allowance for construction of purpose-built rental. Oh, in the 1940s, at the end of the Second World War, we had a catalog of home design that we could draw in to accelerate the design process. We went back to what was done in the 40s, what was done in the 60s in previous housing crises, and what we saw around the world. But in less than a year, we've been successful in shaping a new federal housing policy, and we moved over $65 billion in federal financing and direct investment in market and non-market housing, which is expected to create hundreds of thousands of new units of purpose-built rental housing. Policy announcements also included major new investments in homelessness, including a $250 million encampment program, better late than never, an expansion of the federal homelessness program, and a $50 million homelessness reduction accelerator that we hope to work hand in glove with Built for Zero Canada. We're currently in the process of building a new coalition to build a new national campaign, to build on the success of the Accord and build the political power of our movement to drive for change at federal, provincial, and municipal levels. Remember, homelessness is a housing issue. Housing is controlled by policy, and policy moves at the speed of public opinion, right? We can move public opinion, we can move policy to solve the housing issue. So I talked a bit about homelessness as an unnatural disaster. I spoke earlier about disasters in Calgary and Fort McMurray and Yellowknife. And you're no stranger to disasters here in Australia. Understand that there may be some flooding as we speak up north. So I want you to think, if you think about the last time a disaster struck in Australia, and I think about the floods in Calgary or the fire in Fort McMurray or the fires that threatened Yellowknife, how many people do you suppose are still homeless as a result of those natural disasters? Not many, if any. In those cities, almost none. Which is not to say disaster response is perfect, but 77,000 households were made homeless in a flood in 2013 in Calgary. None of them are still homeless. 85,000 people were evacuated, made homeless by a fire in Fort McMurray. None of them are still homeless, unless, of course, they were homeless before, right? Homelessness, the only difference between homelessness due to a lack of housing and homelessness caused by a natural disaster is the mechanism of the loss of housing, right? The impact is the same. The Calgary flood was one of the most expensive disasters in Canadian history. It cost $6 billion. Homelessness cost the Canadian economy $7.5 billion every year. And that was calculated in 2016 before it's as bad as it is today. In a natural disaster, there is a system in place, a system focused on an urgent response to the crisis, keeping people safe, and most importantly, rebuilding and getting people back in their homes quickly. A lot of you in municipal government are here, and I know you have you have disaster response plans. The response plan that a city can develop is very similar to what you would do in a case of a natural disaster. And so I'm going to talk about some of the main features of these responses and see what you think about how analogous this is to the response to homelessness at a community level. So the first thing, the secret sauce of ending homelessness is strong local leadership. I've looked at homeless systems all over the world, and I guarantee, absolutely 1,000% guarantee, wherever there is success in preventing and reducing and ending homelessness, there is strong local leadership. Ending homelessness is about problem solving. You need strong leaders to solve big problems. In the photo here is the mayor of Calgary. This example is all taken from the flood in Calgary in 2013. His name is Naheed Nenshi. And, you know, there was a hashtag on Twitter that was trending at the time called Nenshi Needs a Nap, because he was everywhere, all the time. But he inspired, he uplifted, he gave voice, he kept people informed, he coordinated the action on the ground, he solved problems, he rallied the community, and he brought resources to bear and was an advocate for the city. Right? Mayors don't have everything they need to solve homelessness. Councils don't have everything they need to solve homelessness. Local agencies don't have everything they need to solve homelessness, but leaders can bring the communities together, can lead through a process and help find those things. This is a photo of the Disaster Management Office, Calgary Emergency Management. Local disaster responses have a command center and a coordinated system, right? This is the Emergency Operations Center. You'll notice in this photo that all of the key players are at the table, right? Police, fire, EMS, the utilities, roads, sewers, you name it. All of the resources are at the table. There's clear leadership in this room, clearly outlined roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. These are highly skilled professionals who are constantly training. They have a system of coordination that allows them to react to a dynamic and constantly changing situation, and they are using real-time data. Look at the pictures on the screen behind them. They're using real-time data to make decisions. This is what coordinated access. This is coordinated access, as you heard in homeless circles. And this is a really important point. Like in disasters, homelessness is dynamic and constantly changing. There's no 140-point plan, 200-point plan, 1,000-point checklist that you can walk through and check these things off and you'll solve homelessness. Homelessness is dynamic, it's constantly changing, and just like disasters, right, it's constantly changing. So you need to see what's happening. You need to understand what's happening on the ground and be able to see that in real time and respond quickly. You got to deal with a crisis and you got to keep people safe. This is a photo inside a shelter that was put up outside in a First Nations community outside of Calgary. So, in a disaster, people will be moved from their homes. They'll go to a reception center. The reception center will get their information and they'll be put into a shelter. But the emergency response to the flood in Calgary was planned, it was coordinated, and it was geared to recovery, and it was geared to housing. Right? Keep people safe, but the whole thing is geared toward getting people back into their homes. And so this woman here is in the shelter with her baby, but we're not expecting her to stay in this cot to receive treatment. We're not expecting her to take counseling or get training or job training or education or skills training or anything before we get her back into her home. Right? But we do that in the homeless system. In Canada, we've certainly seen this. In North America, where the response to homelessness stops at a shelter. So why don't we do this with homelessness? Why don't we have a housing-focused system? It's because we assume that the cause of homelessness is individual, that the flood didn't cause this woman's homelessness. It was some kind of personal fault or failing, right? If she's homeless due to a lack of housing supply, it's housing supply that's the issue. In a disaster, even with the best systems, the systems can get easily overwhelmed. Once we've made sure people are safe, the focus of disaster response goes into rapid rehousing. The lady in the front of that picture is Lorraine Harper. She's the Prime Minister's wife, Prime Minister at the time's wife. And so Calgary, people mobilized to get people back into their homes as quickly as possible. We had to get the water out of the basements, strip out the basements so it was safe for people to go in. And even the most sophisticated disaster management responses can get overwhelmed. But when we reach out to our communities for help, what are we asking them to do? Right? So years ago, the Bishop of Calgary was on my board, and I remember he held the Bishop's Dinner, and he said, in the 70s, when the Vietnamese boat people came to Canada, he said, the church welcomed them into the community. We helped them find homes, we helped them find jobs, we helped them learn English, we got the kids in school, helped them, we helped build a community around them. In the 90s, when Bosnians came, the same thing happened, right? He said, I've got priests that are phoning me now asking for money to put showers in the basements of their churches so that we can shelter people experiencing homelessness. He said, we're asking the faith community the wrong question. We're asking them to shelter. We should be asking them to house and support and care and build community. In a natural disaster, we will often also begin talking about prevention really quickly. This is an image of before the floodwater had even receded, people were talking about how do we prevent something like this from having the impact it had, and people were even talking about building a tunnel under the city to divert floodwater from the two rivers that flow through the city. But today, upstream reservoirs are being created to store water and absorb river flows that led to this kind of flooding. And again, mitigation measures have been made all the way along the river systems. The other thing that's really important about disaster response is that there's no one government responsible for disaster, but they have agreements in place on who does what. And those agreements spell out local leadership with senior government support. Right? Local leadership with senior government support. In this photo is the head of Calgary Emergency Management, the mayor, the premier of the province at the time, Alison Redford, and the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. All levels of government, local governments lead, communities lead, senior levels of government support in their areas of jurisdiction. So, homelessness is an unnatural disaster. And the only difference between homelessness from natural disaster and homelessness from a broken housing system is the mechanism of the loss of housing. And like I said, we can learn a lot from disaster response to shape our homeless systems. The local homeless system is needed to make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. But the system you can use, and that we're trying to use in Canada, is directly analogous to disaster response. Ending homelessness is a continuous improvement process, not a recipe or a checklist. So we also need to have like a nimble, housing-focused, problem-solving approach using real-time data to adapt and respond to a dynamic and rapidly changing reality. And there's a few critical components to the system. As I said, strong local leadership, a shared and measurable aim with a housing focus. And for us, we're using functional zero. And then you have a continuous improvement process with a command center team, a team that's leading it, a governance framework of sorts, and a system for coordination. You need real-time data so that every month you can look at your list and say, okay, what is it we can do to reduce inflow? What is it we can do to get more people off the streets into their homes? What is it we can do to prevent, why are people coming back into our system from housing? How do we stop that from happening? You need a menu of proven technical strategies. Like everything you need to know to end homelessness has been done somewhere. It's amazing how similar Australia and Canada are, right? Housing first programs, prevention programs, like they're all there. And you need flexible housing and service resources. And again, you don't necessarily have enough housing to finish the job of ending homelessness, but I guarantee you have enough to start. In Calgary, my start in the work of ending homelessness was at the Calgary Homeless Foundation. We had a vacancy rate of less than 1%, and in 5 years housed over 4,000 people and reduced homelessness for the first time in 20 years of counting. We built about 3,000 units of new housing in that time, which is more than had been done in the 20 years previous combined. And this is an approach, by the way, that the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness and Advance to Zero communities are using. It's very similar to what we've been doing through Built for Zero Canada. So today we're working with 68 communities around the country. 46 have real-time data. 38 have those coordinated systems in place. 13 have achieved a reduction in chronic or veteran homelessness. Unfortunately, only 4 are managing to sustain that, but despite this wave of new homelessness, we are still able to achieve some reductions, and 4 have ended homelessness for chronic or veterans. So homelessness is solvable. Homelessness is solvable. It's going to be hard, but hard isn't impossible, right? And so how do I know? Well, it happens every day. You know, the city of Toronto in Canada is housing 1,000 people a month out of their shelter system. We know homelessness, the scale that we see it today, hasn't always existed. When we had adequate and affordable housing, we didn't have homelessness like we see today. We resolve homelessness in every natural disaster in communities across Canada, around the world, whether it's here or in the US or in Finland. You know, people are making progress, and there's small signs of progress. I think we respond to homelessness from a lack of housing the way we do because for too long we've individualized the issue. We've made it about mental illness or addiction or bad choices. We made victims undeserving of help by making it their fault. We allow homelessness to go unsolved because we marginalize the people it happens to, and they have no political power. If we're going to solve homelessness, we're going to have to stand and fight, I think. We need to move the public. We need to build political power, and we need to win the political battles. And if there's one lesson that you can take from our experience in Canada is that we can fight those battles and we can win. I was listening to a really great podcast, and I encourage you to look it up. It's by a guy named Mark Horvath from the United States called Invisible People. He did a podcast a little while ago with a guy named Jeff Olivet from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And he compared homelessness to the great social movements of the past. And I think he's right. I think he's onto something. We need to take inspiration from these movements. You know, homelessness is structural. We can have all the housing first programs we want. We can have all the great prevention programs we want. We can have all the great best data and the best research. But if we don't solve the structural issue, if we don't solve the housing issue, we won't get the resources we need, and we can't possibly win. Policy moves at the speed of public opinion. Like the great social justice movements, we have to move the public to our side, build our political power, and win elections. One of the biggest changes that we're making in our strategy in Canada at the Alliance is to build our capacity to win elections. In addition to helping communities build coordinated homeless systems, in addition to supporting frontline organizations build the technical skills, we're building the capacity to fight and win campaigns and shift public policy. We have to stop preaching to the choir and reach out to people outside these walls. 35% of Canadians have either experienced homelessness themselves or know somebody who has. And there are millions of others feeling the pressure of our housing crisis, and more who are supportive of our work. We aim to turn these people into allies and activists who will demand action on housing. And in the great social justice movements, success was never assured. I'm sure the dream of civil rights seemed like a fantasy to too many, if not most, African American people. The dream of marriage equity must have felt totally out of reach. But in many cases, these dreams became reality. But as we're seeing in the US today and around the world, we have to continue to fight to protect those rights. But it took people with a dream to lead, right? It takes people willing to tough out the hard times, lift other people up, to inspire, to mobilize, to act. And that's you, right? That's all of us. I firmly believe homelessness will one day soon be recognized as an enforceable right, and homelessness will end. And as Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. And so with that, I turn to Bruce Springsteen. And I put the slide up and on the plane, and my son's like, what the hell is he doing there? After 9/11, Bruce Springsteen wrote this album called The Rising, and into it is a song called Into the Fire. And, he talks about the first responders that went into the Twin Towers after the planes hit. And he says, in the song, he says, love and duty called you someplace higher, up the stairs and into the fire. And I think of this, and I've started to make it a tradition in our conference at home to close with this. Because, all of you are doing this work of ending homelessness. Frontline workers are doing this work of ending homelessness. Every day, love and duty are calling people to this work. And every day, you and people like you get up and grab a coffee or a tall black or a flat white or whatever you call it, brush off whatever disappointment or frustration you had from the day before, celebrate the win you might have had the day before, and get right back at it, right? Love and duty, it calls you someplace higher. And so I'm going to close with the chorus of this song. And it's a tribute to the people, to all of you, and a thank you to all of you who do this work, and kind of like a prayer for the homeless sector, a prayer for ending homelessness. And the chorus is, may your strength give us strength. May your faith give us faith. May your hope give us hope. And may your love give us love. Thank you.
Tim, thank you so much for your inspiring presentation, and particularly the way you ended there. It was really wonderful. We've got a couple of other people at this conference now who are going to come and join us on the stage. So I'm going to invite Carmel, Haugh and David Pearson to come and sit up here as well. Carmel is she's the Brisbane Zero Community and Systems Lead, and she's also working at Micah projects in Brisbane. And David Pearson is the CEO of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness, not to be confused with the Canadian one. So look, thank you so much, Tim, for setting the scene and giving us that really clear and wonderful understanding of what the Alliance in Canada is all about, and how it is looking at the problem of homelessness. So what we're going to do now is sort of think about what that means for us here in Australia, and talk to a couple of Australian people who have been taking this approach and thinking through these issues in this way here in this country. So I'm going to begin, Carmel, with you. And do you want to come up here, or do you want to sit there to say what you're saying? Happy to sit there? Great. I'll come and join you on the seat in just a second. Look, so Carmel, you're at Brisbane Zero. Obviously, we heard a bit about the Calgary response to the floods before, and the importance of that local leadership and local action. Can you talk about Brisbane Zero? Tell us a bit about what it is, who's involved, how you're involved, what it's trying to do, the kinds of things it gets up to.
Thanks, Tom. And now I know why David wanted me to go second. Great, Tim. That was very inspiring. Thank you very much. Shout out to all of my Meanjin mates. I know there's a lot of Brisbane Zero people here today. Woohoo! We work and play on the lands of Yagara, Jagara and Turrbal people. Last night, I'm just going to start with, there is a bit of data involved with the A to Z movement, but we use the data to humanise what's going on in the world, like Tim has been talking about. Last night in Brisbane, I'll speak of Micah numbers because I checked them this morning. Micah Projects has 174 families in motels and 80 individuals in motels. And based on the Brisbane Zero Know by Name list and our vulnerability data that we collect for First Nation, for the financial year last year, we can pretty much show that through a snapshot that of those families, 70% of them are single parent households. Of those, 70% are now homeless because of a relationship breakdown. Of their children, 34% of them are under 4, and they'll probably spend about 2.2 years homeless. Of the same group, about 81% of those families will be experiencing 81% will be high acuity. So for us and those that know about permanent supportive housing, that's a strong indicator that supportive housing is a requirement for that person or that family to keep recovering. And the same stats will be slightly different for individuals, but I just wanted to highlight what's going on with the families, and that is a disaster. But unfortunately, disaster recovery is fortunately for disasters, the coordination and the disaster recovery management and mechanisms are very fast. People get in their swimming lanes and they swim really, really hard. Unfortunately for this crisis, there's a lot of inertia and indecision making. So what I think, or what we think at Brisbane Zero that is working for us, is that we know each and every one of those families and those individuals by name. And we try to get a good snapshot of their situation, their health and wellbeing situation, the risks that they are currently in through the AHURI, the Australian Vulnerability Triage Tool. So by using a common tool to understand what the situation is and what sort of needs they have. So we try to get about anywhere between 20 and 30% of the people surveyed. We aim for more, but it just depends on the volume of work that's going at the time. And that works for us, and we've had Griffith University do a study, do an evaluation on how we work at Brisbane Zero and look at what the impact of collaboration is on systems change. And we've found the data to be one tool in the kit, but a really important tool for us. And as I said earlier, it helps us paint the portraits of the people that are suffering homelessness at the time. But by working collaboratively, using the data and the by name list, weekly, monthly, quarterly, we can see the trends and what Professor Ingrid Burkett, who was the lead of the study, called weak signals. So 3 years ago when I started at Brisbane Zero, we didn't know how many families were homeless. They were in cars, they were in overcrowded houses, as Neil and the team were talking about yesterday. They were in people's carports and garages. But now we know that 174 last night were in motels in Brisbane. And we can actually start to work on that cohort of people. Whilst we don't have the housing, and we have to be really honest about that, the housing supply is a major issue at the moment. We don't have the housing. The limited supply that we do have, we're working better with. So with that said, I can say since 2021, when we started really applying the framework and the methodology and getting more and more quality data and getting more and more people into Brisbane Zero, In 21-22, we successfully housed, and I've got Brisbane Zero and Logan Zero numbers because we partner with Logan. We housed 443 people. This year, the data's just been printed out in our snapshot data. 863 were housed. So it is working. We are reducing where we can, and I think that by working together and looking at the trends and working in action on the insights that we get from those data trends, like the First Nations cohort strategy that was started up a couple of years ago. When was that? It was after the summit. So the team that were looking at the individuals' rough sleeping data every Friday noted that the same group were coming up over and over again. They might be housed, but they'd come back into inflow. They were all around over 45. They were all First Nations people. So we co-led with AHURI and Murray Watch and Communify, and a number of other people were involved. We looked at that particular cohort really closely for an hour or 2 hours each week for a series of time. They started with, I think it was 30, a group of 30, and by the end of last year, they had permanently housed 100 people in that cohort, who up until I last heard were still housed. So by using the data to humanise the situation and work on an action plan for that particular individual on a weekly basis and coordinate the services that are needed, it really does work to reduce homelessness. And that's what we can do at the moment in the housing supply crisis. We can work better at targeting the resources, the limited resources that we do have, in order to resolve homelessness for one person and one family at a time. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on was the discussion around leadership and local leadership being really important. I can't argue that enough in every discussion that I have around the housing crisis, and I think it does take all of us in the community. We're preaching to the converted here. We know what we're dealing with. There's different ways of solving problems, and each community will have its own unique way of dealing with its problem because it's contextual. The way that we deal with homelessness is contextual. The way we deal with it is different to the way Logan, the way Perth, the way Darwin, Toowoomba will deal with it. But if you know your community and you know the people on your by name list and you know the needs and the support that's required, you can target those resources much better.
Is this an example of, sorry, my mic's not on, but is this an example of what Tim was showing, for example, in that control centre where we had that live data feed of the flood imagery?
Yes.
Is that?
I think so.
Is
I
that
think
what
that's
this
a good
is about?
analogy.
You're sort of bringing, you're having that live data stream in effect coming in
a much lower budget. Yeah, but it is like we do have in real time data. I mean, when I say in real time, it's cross-checked monthly, but it's as close as you're going to get. And by having the right people in the room at those services coordination meetings, which happen every week, we've got one for individual rough sleepers, one for families, and we've just started up one with Brisbane Youth Service, which will be focused on the youth homeless. Shout out to Brisbane Youth Service and all the youth people that are here. That's a really great outcome for us. Yes, so it's actually all of those people that you saw in that coordination room or command and control centre. They're all leaders in their own way. They're invisible leaders in the background, managing the crisis. That's how I feel about the support workers that come to our come to Brisbane Zero and work in it every day. They're making really difficult decisions and really solving very complex problems in such a set of conditions that it's really tough out there. And it goes to some of the conversations about self-care and looking after our talent force. I see the support workers as invisible leaders. They're making really challenging decisions on behalf of their organisations, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, to advocate for these individuals in these communities. And I think that the A to Z methodology really helps highlight that. We had a forum last week in Brisbane with over 250 people there. And the content was designed by the frontline workers, it was presented by the frontline workers, the challenges that they discussed it was all brought together through them. And whilst it's very difficult, the day does motivate people because we can celebrate the achievements. As small as they might seem in the big picture, there's a lot of work that goes in behind it that isn't seen, but I think that that's the true value of A to Z, is that it makes the invisible people that are homeless visible, but it also makes the work visible, and we can infograph it out to our policymakers who need to be sure of perfect, before they go to their constituents with things, but we really don't have time for perfect. We need it to be good, and we'll fix it as we go.
So A to Z, advance to zero, of course, is what that stands for. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But next I want to bring David you into the conversation, and thank you for joining us this morning as well.
Right.
Can you maybe give us some reflections on what you thought watching Tim's presentation, and maybe the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness? Is what you're seeing from the Canadian perspective, is that exactly the same as as the work you're trying to do here in Australia? How does it match up? Are there some differences?
Yeah, there are a few differences, but I think that the similarities are way more than the differences. I think I started in this role as the CEO of the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness a bit over 4 years ago, and the Australian Alliance has been around for about 10 years old now. And we exist of a whole range of communities across the country, like Brisbane Zero, that are committed to ending homelessness and using the approach that Tim sort of outlined in relation to Built for Zero in Canada. We call it Advance to Zero. And essentially, like when I took on this role, one of the first things I was really fortunate to be able to do was get on a plane, go to Calgary and go to Tim's conference and hear from people like Tim and the amazing kind of way in which he's just set the problem out. But actually, I think the powerful part about it for me was we are so used to talking about the problem of homelessness in Australia. And then what they've really done is frame up the solution. And that, this is a housing problem, but that shouldn't be disempowering for us, that there are things that we can do each and every day in our work, in our organisations, in our communities, and that it takes all of those things that Tim talked about. It takes leadership. Like ending homelessness is about leadership, but ending homelessness is also about problem solving. And we problem solve every day with the clients we work with and the work that we do in our own organisations. And I was just super inspired when I got there that they were problem solving at the system level, at scale. Like there were many, many communities that are using data and a by name list data approach where you know everyone by name. And I'd come from being a homeboy here in Adelaide. I'd been in Adelaide for a number of years working on helping establish the Adelaide Zero Project, which is a collaboration that still exists of all of the sector that work in the CBD, so the square mile that we're in right now of Adelaide. We created one of the first quality by name lists in Australia that sought to count down to the goal of ending homelessness, inspired by the work of what the Canadian Alliance were doing, but also by the work of organisations like Micah and the Brisbane Alliance and others across Australia who'd been doing this work for a number of years. And really that work, you could describe it as a housing first system approach. So it's trying to change the way in which your local systems work to make them more housing first focused, to make sure that we're able to give the scarce housing resources that we've got to those that are the most vulnerable in a community, knowing them by name. And so that big shift from, where the Australian Alliance have been working on, been creating initiatives, and there's a lot of the WA community here as well, and they were real pioneers in this, in sort of counting up to the goal of housing the most vulnerable people you found in your community. So many people might have come across the idea of the 500 Lives campaign, which was the precursor to Brisbane Zero that Carmel's from, or the 50 Lives campaign and the 20 Lives campaigns in WA, in Perth and Fremantle, which was coincidentally supported by St Pat's. Got you in there, plug there, Michael. So those campaigns that were counting up to housing as many people as we could find shifted to this idea of counting down. And that's where this idea of ending homelessness, I think, is really, really important. And I think one of the things that I've been blessed to do since not only getting on a plane and visiting Canada when I first started in this role, But a couple of years later, I managed to snag a Churchill Fellowship, which allows you to travel around the world and learn about the problem of homelessness. So I got to go back to Canada and see the progress that Tim and the communities are making in those communities that have ended homelessness for chronic homelessness, and used the data and the service coordination forums to treat it like an emergency that it is. But I also got to visit some of the US communities that have also done the same thing. There's 16 communities in the United States that have made homelessness rare, brief, non-reoccurring. And I also got to go to Finland, where we all talk about Finland all the time and think about, what is it that we can learn from Finland? And I wish we, as Australia, were a lot more like Finland than we are like the United States and a little bit like Canada, but we're not. We're not very comparable to Finland. Just one of the couple of key examples of when I was in Finland. You don't choose what school your kids go to in Finland. There is one schooling system. And so the level of equality, or inequality, I should say, in that country is next to nothing compared to what we have here. So the housing crisis that we have and that Canada has in the US, that, as Tim was saying, started in the 80s, which is exactly the same as us. We started disinvesting in public housing, and we went through the Abbott era of trying to cut the National Housing and Homelessness Agreement and scrapped all those things. They didn't do that in Finland. They have continued to invest in community and public housing. So they are reducing homelessness because this is a housing crisis. But the housing first process that they use in Finland is comparable for us. They take a health approach to this, which is very comparable to what Canada and the US have done. So homelessness is a solvable problem, but if we take the leadership, if we drive the improvements, and if we problem solve, that's the kind of key lesson that I've picked up from reinforcing from what I heard from Tim, that is absolutely as applicable here, as that is a very apt description of what we face.
Tim, at the start of your talk, you mentioned as homelessness has become much more of a catastrophe in Canada, that there's been a move in public sentiment, unfortunately, away from a more compassionate response and towards a more enforcement type of activity. So can you just elaborate a bit on that and how you have sought to counter that shift in the narrative?
Well, frankly, we haven't been nearly as good at it as we need to be. I think the rise of encampments in Canada was predictable. Like, we knew it was going to happen. We didn't react fast enough to it. And I really feel for mayors and councils. When you are in a city where you see surging homelessness, you want to, the public is beginning to feel really uncomfortable with, having open drug use on our transit system, having, encampments in their parks. Even our most progressive allies are, getting really quite uncomfortable with it. And so mayors and councils are faced with, they need to do something. And I think I have a very long woulda, coulda, shoulda list. And my woulda, coulda, shoulda list, what I wish we would have done sooner was give councils the tools, right? Is to sit down with them and say, this is a housing-focused response to an encampment, right? Because they're looking for something to do. They know they need to do something, but the only tools at their disposal are the tools of municipal government, which is often things like enforcement, right? The public is wanting this problem resolved. They would prefer a solution that is humane, but in the absence of a humane option, they're going to use enforcement. So I wish we were faster at bringing cities and encampment resolution response. We could sit down with mayors, sit down with councils and staff or communities, and walk people through a housing-focused resolution to rough sleeping. We're starting to do that now. We're going to be ramping that up over the course of this fall, your spring, and I expect that you'll see more from us on that soon. That's also why we, again, have a federal encampment program to provide funding directly to communities to provide housing-focused resolution. So what I wish I would done is got on this 3 years ago, but the next best time is now, so we're going to get on it now.
Can I just riff off that? The local government situation, like the local government leadership is so important, but also very, very challenging in our country. I think from a systems change perspective, in order for us to make local leaders and politicians, whether they be at the local, state or national level for this country, we need the culture in our country to change and stop othering the poor and marginalised people. There's a movement in this country called Yes in My Backyard. It's global. But unless the planning changes and unless we're all willing to accept townhouses or social housing in our street, suburb or city, we're not going to fix this problem. And therefore the local leadership are going to default to politicising the issue. I just have a real personal and professional bugbear about that. It's one of the toughest for us to get through in this country, I think. And rather than blaming the policymakers and the politicians, I think we need to look at us as a society, and housing and social infrastructure. We should all accept good quality, well-designed social housing in our suburbs and our streets in order for us to even start to fix this massive mess that we're in.
Well, it's interesting, you know, when you think about it, when you're working in, when you're doing frontline work, one of the things that, you know, I learn about is how, you know, we will engage with a client and try and figure out, you know, why they're doing what they're doing, try and figure out what's the mutually agreed outcome. How do we negotiate a change of behavior? How do we negotiate a change? And you know, part of what I think is important in overcoming NIMBYism and getting to that YIMBY piece is understanding what's behind it. And I think what's behind it often is fear. And how do we address those very real public concerns about open drug use, about encampments, about public safety, right? It's not to say it's right or wrong, but we have to acknowledge that it's there and find a way to address it and build that mutually agreeable outcome. And eventually I think we can get to that, you know, get to that space.
And perhaps we need groups like AHURI to be doing some data collection around that and looking for the signals of where and why are we in this culture in Australia so fixated on not building social housing. The money's coming down the pipeline, the evidence is there. That's the great thing about the A to Z methodology as well, is we can help the government target the types of housing, the different types of housing that will be needed, whether it be supportive housing or social housing and affordable housing.
And, David, this fear and I guess that response of enforcement or, you know, criminalisation. Are you concerned about that anywhere in Australia happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is, you know, Tim talked about, you know, benefits of hindsight. We can see what's coming. Like the housing crisis is likely to get worse before it gets better. The housing investments that are coming are happening, but they're slow. And do we know that those housing investments that are going to happen, are they going to flow through to helping some of the most vulnerable in the communities and the people that many of us in this room work with? I think there's a real concern about that. But where there's a threat or a challenge, there's also an opportunity that actually, you know, if you talk to the property industry, for example, like they're building infrastructure projects in our capital cities, and then they're having, you know, and they're trying to do place-making activities and all these sorts of things. And then you're having people sleeping rough in those kind of areas. There's a sort of dissonance there that they recognise that's a problem. And so finding the unlikely allies, I think, is part of that shifting public opinion, and we have to make new connections and make those alliances across different silos so that, you know, we're not just talking to ourselves as the specialist homelessness system or the community housing system or the public housing system. We need to go out and make those allies relationships with local councils and find those partners in local governments and with business groups and with the health system and all the other human services systems that when they fail, what ends up happening is you result in homelessness. So I think that's what the sort of inspiring part for me, I guess, about Advance to Zero is it's about providing a framework for helping those pieces of collaboration to come together and say that this isn't something that we can solve on our own, but it is a solvable problem. We solve homelessness every day for the individuals who walk through our doors and the support services we provide. But we can also solve homelessness as a community, but it takes the whole community to get involved in the structures and the collaboration and the data and all of those elements. And so Tim put on screen before their approach as the Canadian Alliance to Ending Homelessness, and that's what Carmel and I have been talking about this advanced to zero framework. It's a way of stepping through, not as a recipe that gives you all the answer, but as a way of stepping through what are the things that we need to do to demonstrate that ending homelessness is possible, community by community, cohort by cohort. It's not that the inner city of Adelaide is more important than any other part of South Australia. It's not that rough sleeping is more important than couch surfing or overcrowding. But if we're going to demonstrate that this is a solvable problem, if we're going to make public opinion change and we're going to get the investment we need to solve this problem, then we need to break this problem up. We need to make it local, we need to make it clear with data, and we need to build the allies and the relationships that help us get to that outcome.
Thanks. I'm keen to take some questions from the room. We have a couple of roving mics, 2 at the front, I believe, and I think 2 at the back. But please, apologies, it's a bit tricky for me to see from here. I do think there's a question at the front there. The lights are coming up. So, and there's another question sort of in the middle. If you go up to the, someone's got their hand up, to that.
Hi, my name's Helen.
We'll take this one here first, but then we'll go over there. Thank you.
I am a lived experience freelancer. Now I hear a lot about stats and I hear about all these, on the screen there, but here's my thing. Where's the lived experience voice here? Where are we actually taking away the barriers for everyone to come together? And I'm not just talking about organisations, I'm not talking about governments, I'm talking about everyday people, because together we can solve this problem. But every time we're very slow to get off the ground because there's other things we could be doing and having a lot more, but we're putting barriers there. We're not wanting to work together. You know, we've got lived experience in this room. We've got lived experience in your organisations, but no one is actually identifying themselves as that. We have powers. And, you know, you've got to start taking away those barriers, because otherwise nothing is going to change, because we're going to do the same old thing and wanting the same results.
Love to hear some responses to that. Thank you.
Do you want to go first, Sid, what you do in Canada? Do you want to explain a little bit about what you do in Canada?
Well, part of what we're doing is, one of the things that we're doing is trying to reduce those barriers, exactly what you're talking about. And I think the tools of modern political campaigning allow us to engage individuals. And I think we want to find and identify Stats Canada recently released data that showed that 1.6 million Canadians have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. Now imagine if 1.6 million Canadians, 1.6 million Australians had the ability to engage in the political process. We're supported to engage in the political process. Imagine 36% of Canadians either have experienced or know someone who has, right? Imagine, Canadian majority governments are elected on 35% of the voting public, right? Imagine if those barriers to participation were removed and they were engaged and they were empowered. There is no government in the Western world who's going to push around a population of 35%, right? But we've allowed that to happen because we've allowed people to be marginalized and not allowed them or not helped.
And I think that at a structural level, 100% agree. At a more practice kind of level, like in Australia, agree with that. But then also, we have a practice lead as the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness on Lived Experience. Lorna, she's in the room, and she helped work on the framework that was part of the Constellations project to develop a framework for lived exclusion inclusion, to make sure, lived experience inclusion, to make sure that we have the voice of lived experience involved in all of the work that we do. Because as you rightly pointed out, there are voices across the room right now. They're involved in many of the organisations. And this is a journey that we're on as a sector that I think actually is one of the bright spots, that we are getting better at including lived experience voices, recognising the value of that, and doing it in a way that is not, transactional or re-traumatising or tokenistic, but actually genuinely changing the nature of the conversations so that the local systems that we're trying to change focus on the needs of the people in those systems and their experiences, rather than the needs of the policymakers or the funders or the processes that we have.
And Helen, that's such an excellent point, and I think we never underestimate the amount of lived experience our support workers have, who are working with people every day, every hour, And by them coming to our services coordination meeting each week and advocating for that individual or that family, that's as close as we're going to get to having lived experience in the room. I know it's not perfect, but given the conditions that we're all working in, we've designed the process. Yes, yes.
Because, yes, building houses is going to take time. We can come up with solutions that we can use our resources. We can do it in third world countries, everybody. We can crowdfund and can get that with less resources. We've got plenty of resources and we're not using them. We're not bringing them together on the local level. What Canada is doing is far more doing that. Because everybody's involved. It's not just the councillors, it's everyday people that are coming together to do this. That's what Australia is not about. It's not about people. It's about other things. And we have to be people focused.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We've got a question there as well.
Hi, my name's Hannah and I work in public policy. I was wondering if you think that the public's opinion could be swayed if we changed the narrative from a YIMBY attitude exclusively to saying with YIMBY comes along a wide range of facilities that benefit your community as well. So yes, social and public housing in your backyard, but yes, that also comes with youth programs in your backyard. It comes with an increased level of emergency services in your backyard. It comes with an increased number of community halls in your backyard. It comes with a huge number of additional services that those people will need. It comes with mental health units in your backyard.
Yep.
And if you provide more than just the housing, if you provide all of the support services in your backyard with those houses, will that likely change public opinion and sway them more towards YIMBY instead of NIMBY? Or do you think that there are other solutions to help change that public opinion?
I get a little bit worried about this NIMBY-YIMBY thing. Like, I think that it kind of puts us in camps.
Sorry,
like
I shouldn't have brought it up.
You know, so I think what we've got to do is try and find the common ground. And the idea around Advance to Zero is we create this concept in a local community. So the Adelaide Zero Project, to use the local example, it's an idea. It's the concept of like a community gets together to fight for and build their local town, you know, their local school or their local hospital, or that. How do you build a system? So the Adelaide Zero Project is a concept to say, how do we all as a community get behind this idea that people shouldn't be living and dying on what is one of the most livable, beautiful cities in the world? That we should have a home for everyone, and the standard that should be set here is that homelessness is rare, brief and non-reoccurring. And so in that sense, Advance to Zero is about creating these local collaborations around the country, and there's 38 of them at the moment that are sort of in development and differing levels along that journey, saying, inviting the community in to be part of a collective effort to changing the way in which housing was provided to some of the most vulnerable in those communities. I think that's a way of shifting public opinion. And I think public opinion, it does shift, it takes time, but it does get there. And I think you've got to find ways to build the common ground rather than sort of build it on a basis of conflict and those sorts of things. So shaping public opinion is a hard thing, but it takes time, but eventually when it changes, it changes.
Yeah, then I would say yes and. So I think there's he's absolutely right. And I would also say, but when you get to a neighborhood discussion, when you get to the point where we want to put this facility in your particular community, what we've experienced and seen work really well is a conversation with the community. Like, it's a facility. We in a lot of places will have these things called good neighbor agreements now, where we're negotiating the presence of facilities in a community, and more often than not, we're able to address and understand what the concerns might be. And once we understand what the concerns might be, we can put in measures to alleviate those concerns and kind of negotiate the presence in a community. And I've done 25 of those around it in Calgary in previous years, and I've seen those taken to scale. So it's kind of building the public opinion around a solution at a community level, and then thinking, at a neighborhood level, when you want a facility introduced, we've had a lot of success in just negotiating presence in that community as opposed to dropping a new project in a neighborhood and surprising everyone with it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to try and squeeze in one last question, I believe.
We've got a question just at the back there.
Yep.
Right side. Hello.
Where are we looking? Has someone with a question got a microphone? Or can someone run over there? Thanks. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. My name's Donna Bennett and I'm the CEO of Hope Street Youth and Family Services. We serve the people in the Melbourne area, the north and western suburbs, so it's Wurundjeri country there. I've worked in this sector with young people who are homeless for over 30 years. And what I find incredibly disappointing and a major barrier is that very few young people are able to access social housing. So clearly, for a period of time now, many years now, we see that the government direction is around providing housing through social housing. There's a clear move away from public housing. There's a clear move away from transitional housing, so other forms of housing, and there's an enormous investment going on in social housing. That is fantastic. I applaud that. However, our statistics show that 0.4% of young people on Centrelink income were able to access social housing. 0.4% of young people on Centrelink income are the head lease of public housing. This is totally appalling, unacceptable, and we need to see some change. Now, there are a range of excuses for this, and I think we need to not be looking at excuses. We need to be looking at solutions so that young people who are one of the most vulnerable groups and often on their own without a parent or without anyone else to support them, trying to navigate a system and continue to work towards a better life for themselves. I think that there has to be significant change in the way we think about it. Young people, their income is $250 a week. $250 a week. It's the lowest form of social income, the lowest form. They should be at the top of the list, not at the bottom and not able to get in. I'd be interested in your opinion on how we can turn this around.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question and for the work that you're doing in Melbourne. Carmel, I want to hear about what's happening for youth homelessness as part of Brisbane Zero.
Thank you. I didn't catch your name. Hope Street Youth Family Services. You might be interested in reaching out to Brisbane Zero next week. We've been working in collaboration for a couple of years with Brisbane Youth Service to lead a youth by name list. And I go back to the original discussion about if we know people by name and we know their needs and we know their supports, we can advocate for that person to the organisation, the communities that need to help them, and also to the systems change. We can do the systems change advocacy we need to do to support the type of social housing that we need for that group. That's one thing. If we get our facts and figures right and we get our names right, we can actually form a united way of taking that argument and that absolutely necessary piece of the puzzle to where it needs to go. But I would also urge us to think about keeping families together, and I know that's not always great, but there's different ways of doing it with supportive housing models and supportive services and sustaining tenancies. But it's not only just the income that prevents young people from getting access to safe housing. There's a whole range of activity, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I guess what we've done in Brisbane with Pam and Di and Rico at Brisbane Youth Service is formulate a specific by name list for the youth under 24. So there are those nuances addressed through the common triage tool, and there is a separate list that the youth service providers are working from, and that's one way of getting the advocacy that you need done with the right facts and figures. We can help you, and it humanises. Again, I don't want you to think that it's all about data, because the data's the journey, it's not the destination. It's actually, and I've pinched that quote from someone, I can't quite remember who it was now, but it's about humanising the person behind it. It's not about saying, well, we've got 0.1% of youth not getting access to the houses. Let's change the conversation around to, well, we've got a solution for you because we know this is why they're not getting those houses.
Yeah, Tom, I know we've got to wrap up, don't we? So, like Tim finished with a Bruce Springsteen quote, and I thought I might finish with another Bruce quote, which is Bruce Wayne, or Batman. And he said the night is darkest just before the dawn. And I think that the frustration that we feel in the moment that we're in now is palpable. It is pretty dark out there. The work that we have to do, the people we are helping, the sheer weight of the housing crisis that we face. But change is possible. Communities are trying to demonstrate that. There is hope around the corner. There are communities around the world that are demonstrating that this is a solvable problem. There are communities in this room that are demonstrating that this is a solvable problem. But we have to change the way we work. We have to work outside the silos we're used to. We have to make those alliances. We have to include those lived experience voices. And we need to set that ambition to make ending homelessness the goal, because what else is acceptable? If we don't make that the goal, what are we doing? So I invite you to think about how the things we've talked about, the work that the Canadian Alliance are doing, that Brisbane Zero is doing, and talk to the other communities in Australia who are doing this work and think about how can you support that? How can we get more involved in work that's outside our own organisational silos, that supports the needs of the people in the systems that we're here to support?
Thanks, David. A great way to end.
Well done.
Well, thank you all very much for your time this morning and your insights, and thank you everyone else. And I invite you now to join us for morning tea in the exhibition hall.